Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our Courageous Conversations series. This is with South Coast Interfaith Council. I'm Jonas Hayes. I'm pastor of Grace First Presbyterian Church in Long Beach, and I am a board member of South Coast Interfaith Council. We've been having a series of conversations every Friday afternoon at 3 o'clock. We've had some wonderful speakers. These have been about 45 minutes, just maybe a heads up that we may go closer to an hour. And so just to let you know, if you need to bow out early, you certainly can do so. But I know a lot of people are really interested in this topic, and so we may need a little bit more time and to allow plenty of time for questions and answers. We have with us today Dr. Arozullah, and Milia, our executive director, is going to introduce him. But first, let me just go over kind of our protocol. And Cheryl, if you could just share our Zoom protocol. And this is probably old hat for most of you by now, but I'll go quickly. And we just ask that you would be on mute or remain on mute until you have a question to ask. You can ask a question to me. You could send it privately through the Zoom chat. You certainly could send it to everyone if you'd like. Also, ask, pray, love, offer a word of encouragement. You feel free to use that chat bar to do that. As we hear the presentation this afternoon and as folks ask questions. Also, this is, not a perfect process, so we just ask for your grace as we learn in this new way through Zoom. And Milia, would you share a little bit about our guest? We're really, really excited. And I spoke with him earlier this week. He's an absolute delight, Dr. Arozullah. We're thrilled, and he's even had experience in the town where I grew up, Mexico. Well, not where I grew up, but where I was born, Mexico, Missouri. I mean, most people haven't even heard of this town, and here he has been there many times and has driven through it. And anyway, we're thrilled to have you. Milia, share just a little bit about our guest today.
Sure. Thank you so much, Jonas. And Jonas, welcome back. We missed you. We're glad that you're back and that you're part of this again. And to all of you as well, I know that we used to we used to meet every Friday, and now we've changed it to the first Friday of the month. So it's good to see familiar faces. So thank you for joining us today. And Dr. Arozullah, thank you for joining us today. Just a little bit about who he is. Dr. Arozullah, he completed his undergrad in his medical school at Northwestern University. And then after his internal medicine residency at Northwestern Memorial Hospital in Chicago, he went on to obtain his master's in public health and general internal medicine fellowship at Harvard. Thereafter, he served as an associate professor of medicine at the University of Illinois, where he focused on both research as well as teaching. His interest in research led him to his current position, which is being the executive medical director in medical services, particularly focusing on the field of oncology at Astellas Pharma, where he provides medical oversight for global clinical trials for new cancer therapies. Aside from that, he also serves as a board member of Darul Qasim, which is a leading institute of higher Islamic studies based in Illinois, and is also a senior member of the Islamic Bioethics Group. So he's clearly very busy, and we're very, very, very grateful for you to take the time and to be with us today. So thank you so much for being a part of this conversation this afternoon.
Thank you for the introduction, Milia.
Thank you, Milia. And the theme today is what you should know about COVID-19 vaccines, testing, and immunity, answers to your questions. And because we've said answers to your questions, we're counting on your own questions. I have a few to get us started, and I'm anticipating that we'll have the second half be your questions, which again, you could send to me through the chat. Or you may ask your own question. I want to do first come, first serve. So if your question gets submitted first, you're more likely to get that question asked, just to let you know. Dr. Arozullah, the first question that I would like to ask, especially because the context of this is South Coast Interfaith Council, and a lot of our partners come from various congregations, from different religious traditions. And so what I would like to ask is how your worldview and how your religious perspective impact your current work and your role in healthcare.
Thank you so much for the question, Pastor Jonas. And again, it's a great honor to be with everybody this afternoon. It's late in the afternoon on a Friday here in Chicago, so I can imagine everyone's had a long week already. And specifically to the question that you're asking, there are several elements to answering that question. So again, as a Muslim, coming from the Islamic tradition, our foundational belief when it comes to illness and healing and wellness really revolves around our understanding and appreciation of God as the one who heals. So appreciating that God is the one who heals, our role as people who want to participate in that process of healing is how do we engender bringing down God's healing upon other human beings? How do we participate in that process? And as Muslims, we look to God's prophets, God's messengers, as examples of how to do that. And I'm sure people on this call are very familiar with the stories of Jesus healing people. We have many advices from Prophet Muhammad as to how to approach the healing of human beings and the things that we do to engender that. And it's being a part of that tradition from the perspective of being someone who participates in that process of healing that really has been a big part of why I've chosen kind of the path that I've chosen. I think as many of us, the path that sometimes we chose in life, also we appreciate that that's a guided path and kind of how you come to those steps. But I think the gist of the answer is trying to be a person who's participating in the process of bringing down God's healing among people and hoping that with that God will be even pleased with me. That's really maybe the simplest answer.
Okay, that's excellent. Thank you so much. And I don't know if it's just on my end or on other people's end, but I could hear pretty much everything you said, but it got a little bit choppy there. I'm not sure if it's what. I don't know if you have a way to check your Wi-Fi and just see.
Let me check here.
Yeah. And I will ask another question here. And I really like that, especially, I mean, that really reflects a lot of the theology, the Reformed faith, and at least in my religious tradition, as well as a Presbyterian, mainline Christian denomination, that participating in the healing work of Almighty God, that it's not just one person's capability to kind of achieve this, but we're part of that divine work. I really like that. So the question then I would like to ask you is, how do we understand the different sectors of the healthcare community and how they address COVID-19? This is just knowing that out of different disciplines, of course, there is a different way to address COVID-19 specifically. So maybe you can help give us a holistic perspective to understand how those different sectors work together or even work individually to effectively address COVID-19.
Sure. And if it's, I think one of the challenges of being someone who's in the pharmaceutical industry and talking to the respected members of this group, there are going to be some preconceived notions of who works in the pharmaceutical industry. And I always get a kick out of speaking at bioethics conferences and introducing myself as someone who works for a pharmaceutical company. People see an inherent conflict there. And all joking aside, there definitely is that conflict, and that does exist. What I thought might be helpful, and if it's okay, I'm just going to share my screen here, is I think one of the challenges of understanding something like a COVID-19 pandemic, and this is from the perspective of the United States specifically, but you could also expand this into understanding how these different sectors intersect even internationally to address such a pandemic. So we have obviously a government sector, and that government sector operates on numerous levels. It operates on a federal level, a state level, a local level. Those primarily come through one element, and that is to drive research. It has to do with providing public health support. The government sector also is critical in providing guidance to how both businesses, private citizens, how everybody kind of operates and how do they protect themselves in such a pandemic. And we've seen different layers of government really operate in different ways during this pandemic. And we also, I think everyone appreciates the challenges of that oversight and dealing with that. Again, government has a certain perspective on that issue, but often government in and of itself is unable to deliver specific cures to these pandemics. And their role often is more in terms of emergency management or guidelines or being able to manage the day-to-day lives and repercussions of such a pandemic. Another sector is sort of what I call the healthcare delivery sector, and that is what we typically think of: the doctors, the nurses, the respiratory therapists, the hospitals, the clinics, all of the healthcare infrastructure that cares for the patients, both as they're becoming ill and when they become severely ill. And we've also seen this sector of the healthcare system be very burdened during this time. The academic sector is another sector that I've spent a good part of my career in, and that's also a sector where primarily you're looking for the knowledge of how to approach curing such a pandemic and what are the strategies that should be there or where the cures might come from. And then we have these other two sectors that I think sometimes don't get talked about a lot, but in this sort of a pandemic have really come to the forefront. And that is what we call the biotechnology and the pharmaceutical industries. And these are, by their very nature, in a place like the US, these are for-profit companies. And the other elements that we've talked about so far primarily are not for profit. So there is a fundamentally different system, and and sometimes there are very different motives for how these parts participate in this ultimate cure. But nonetheless, there are certain things that biotechnology companies and pharmaceutical companies do particularly well. Maybe they've done that because they want to turn a profit, to be frank, but they do certain things particularly well, and one of those things is develop new cures. And that process, in conjunction with the government, in terms of the oversight of that, is kind of what we're going to probably spend a little bit of time talking about today. And that's kind of where my sweet spot is, and that's kind of where I spend a good part of my life, is in that nexus. But all of these sectors coming together, I think everyone has heard something from each of these sectors in terms of addressing the COVID-19 pandemic. And I think ultimately, if we're trying to get back to kind of life is what used to be kind of a normal, then all of these sectors will have to make their adequate contribution. And I think that is one of the huge challenges that we have. And then you have to multiply that by being able to do this and coordinate this internationally as well for a pandemic that really does not observe any kind of national borders. So it is a huge challenge, but I think just as an introduction to respond to your question, Pastor Jonas, I thought this might be a helpful construct if it might generate some questions.
You know, I think I might want to entertain some questions now as Dr. Arozullah has shared this slide. Are there any questions at this? I know we ask questions usually at the end, but is there any at this kind of stopping point? Has it kind of stimulated any question that anybody would like to ask now? Okay. If not, then I think go ahead and continue, or do you want me to ask the next question, or do you want to say kind of more to this?
No, I think that's fine for now. If you want to proceed with the next question, and then maybe we can try to build from there.
Okay. You know, question that I have, you know, we hear about vaccines and then we hear about cures, and I don't think they're synonymous, you know. I guess, you know, to that, I guess a question I'd like to ask is, you know, is a vaccine for COVID-19 a cure? And that is, you know, we hear a lot about, people talk about going back to normal. Of course, people mean different things when they say that, but once a vaccine is available, what is the timeline for life to return back to normal? That is in terms of kind of our social interactions, what we kind of anticipate in terms of going to live concerts or, you know, going to houses of worship without worrying about getting sick from COVID-19, something like that. So that's the question. Is a vaccine for COVID-19 a cure? And what is the timeline for life to return back to normal? And that is social interaction wise.
Sure. So if I knew the answer to the question of how long it would take, I probably wouldn't have time to speak with you today. So that is a very expensive and worthy question. To be very frank, I'm not sure. But I think there are a couple of concepts that might be helpful to the audience, to the folks on the call. And let me see here if we can. I apologize. I'm just gonna maybe try to share again. I'm sorry, Pastor Joe, are you seeing the slides again?
I see it says that you've started to share the screen. There we go.
You are seeing it, right?
Yes.
Okay, so one of the things that always comes up when we're talking about vaccines, and I'm sure probably everyone's kind of heard this in all the news reporting about this, is this concept of herd immunity. So one of the reasons that there's so much emphasis on developing a vaccine is that we have, it is a fascinating virus. As horrible as it is from a scientific vantage point, this is a fascinating virus. And one of the characteristics of this virus is that people are able to transmit this virus to other human beings even before they themselves are sick. And that's actually one of the challenges. So people are carrying the virus, they're not exhibiting any symptoms, they don't have a fever, they actually feel fine, but they're actually contagious. They're able to transmit the virus to another human being at that time. And for that kind of a circumstance, that's part of why all of these 7 to 14-day quarantines come into place and so on. So one of the big public health strategies here is to develop a vaccine such that we create what's called herd immunity. And the idea with herd immunity is, this is kind of the state we're in right now on the left part of the slide, and that is that when one person becomes infected, and now we don't even know if that person is infected because they're not exhibiting symptoms, they tend to transmit the virus to other people all around them. And it's not clear who is going to get it, who's not going to get it, and it's very difficult to track. And this is why we see different spikes of numbers in different parts of the country, and then it kind of cools down for a while and goes back up. But this is really the circumstance, unfortunately, that we find ourselves in right now, where there really is very, very few people in the population right now that have immunity against the virus. The idea with a vaccine is that we want to basically create a bunch of these green stick figures, people with the vaccine that now have immunity against the virus. So even if there is someone who is infected, because most of the people around them have this immunity, basically are not susceptible to the virus, it really diminishes the ability of that virus to go to the people who are further away from them. So if you look at this diagram, this poor soul who's like 2 people away gets infected because there's not a green person in between to block them. Whereas in this circumstance, this person is kind of protected because this person has immunity. So they don't carry the virus, they don't get the virus, and therefore they don't transmit it. So the reason why there's so much emphasis on a vaccine is that we basically are trying to create, even if it's a proportion of the population, but the more of the population that is basically in this green color, then we're able to really isolate the pockets and diminish the ability of the virus to spread through the population. So that's kind of why the vaccine is so critical. It is different conceptually than the people who are read in this diagram. The vaccine doesn't provide them a cure. So again, your question was, is a vaccine a cure for the disease? The answer is no. What it can do is it can tremendously diminish the number of people getting infected, and therefore the number of people who ultimately succumb to the virus. I mean, obviously we've lost a huge number of souls all over the world to this virus. And the idea is that if we can begin to vaccinate people, we begin to protect those pockets of people, particularly those people who have not gotten the virus yet. And so the vaccine is a huge contribution to try to short circuit that process. It's a long answer to a complex question, but maybe I'll pause there to see if there's some clarifying questions to that.
Okay, great. Thank you. And the visual is very helpful in seeing this. And I do think, I don't know, Dr. Arozullah, if there's a place that's closer to your router or Wi-Fi connection, but I think the sound is coming through choppy.
Okay.
I'm picking up on most of what you're saying, but it is kind of stopping and starting. I don't know if it's the shared screen that's making a difference or if it's just maybe the, anyway.
The bandwidth.
That's always a challenge. You never know if somebody's on another device at the same time, can kind of distract that too. So
yeah.
Anyway, you might just explore that and see if there's something you can do. So let's see. He asked for questions. Are there any questions about what he's shared thus far?
Steve.
Jonas, Doctor, I have a question, and I know so much of the questions are speculative, and viruses have a mind of their own. But when folks in the academy as well as the health community examine what Sweden did, what did we learn from that could create possibly a hybrid, or can viruses be managed that way?
Yeah. Are you hearing me okay?
Yeah, now?
Okay. Yes. I have to answer this question carefully because I see the Swedish flag on your fridge. So we'll have to...
I'll go ahead and educate no, it's my entire family, well, my wife's family, my wife is 4th generation, but each of the sisters revolted and did not marry Swedish men. So you don't have to be careful because I've converted them all away from that. So
excellent. That's very well said. I think Sweden. I think it's a fascinating question. So again, just for everyone's knowledge, Sweden took the approach actually of not shutting down anything, basically, of continuing essentially life as normal, with the idea that they would inevitably lose some people. I apologize. I'm actually going to try to call in by my phone just so you can hear me a little bit better. So I apologize. Give me about 30 seconds, and I will call back in.
That's a good B. Yeah. Okay.
Okay. So.
Thank you.
Hey, Jonas.
Yeah.
I'm sorry that I take those personal moments to educate everybody about my family when I know none of these folks very well at all.
That was great. That was interesting. I actually didn't know that, so that was fascinating.
I mean, yeah, so he saw that. I mean, I'm at our family cabin above Santa Cruz that the family built in 1974. The fact that he saw the Swedish flag on the refrigerator.
That's incredible.
Brilliant, a brilliant mind and eyesight.
Yeah, he is. It's on multiple levels.
Yeah.
Oh man, that's great. Thanks for folks kind of communicating that. It's always hard to tell if everybody's experiencing the same thing, or so. I appreciate folks chiming in and letting us know about the sound.
So there was.
Yeah, go ahead, Amelia.
There was an article, I forget in what publication, but it said that the 2 most popular phrases of 2022 thus far is 1, "You're muted," and 2nd, "Can you hear me? Are you choppy?" so we play right into that. So clearly that article has some merit to it. We're exhibiting it right now.
Great. I do think calling in is a good plan, though, because that should work well.
Yeah.
Sometimes on our Zooms for work, they tell us to take our videos off, and and I don't know if that is also playing a role, but for presentations, we're encouraged not to have the video on and be occupying space. But
Cheryl, can you let Dr. Arozullah in?
Yes, I just did.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Then there's probably some kind of unmute option if you're the 773 number. Oh, here we go. Yeah.
Okay. Does that work better?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. So sorry. My apologies. Yeah, I think somebody's watching a movie on something downstairs. So yeah, there's probably a challenge to my Wi-Fi. We were talking about Sweden, if I recall correctly, and that as an example. So I think there has been quite a bit written about these 2 examples and the kind of the opposite results and kind of the different strategies. So one strategy was Sweden's strategy, where they did not close down anything, and they basically were trying to develop herd immunity, what we just showed on the screen, with the idea that they would lose some of their citizens, because when you're trying to establish herd immunity, obviously there are people that are going to get sick. And I think Sweden is the nature of Sweden and the people there, they, as a society, I think they were okay with that idea, that in order to, what they hoped would be to save more people, they were, in essence, sacrificing some people. And again, I think that is a very tricky ethical position, and it's a great conversation piece, I think, for people to contemplate about. The reality is that circumstance has not necessarily worked out that well. And the numbers that we're seeing in Sweden, as well as the mortality that we're seeing in Sweden, is not necessarily any better. And it's not clear that the immunity is actually established. And one of the reasons for that is that strategy works when we are dealing with viruses that we think immunity is long lasting and that we understand the immune response to that virus. And one of the things I think that people sometimes underappreciate is we talk about COVID-19, there's usually a little letter N in front of that, and that stands for novel. It's a novel virus. And it's really a virus that we don't understand that well, even from the immunological perspective. And one of the challenges is, what kind of immune response do patients develop after they recover from the virus? And a scary question is, how long does that immunity last? So a herd immunity strategy works if that immunity is long lasting, either whether that's induced by a vaccine or actual infection. And what some of the preliminary data are telling us right now is that one of the challenges with this vaccine, with all of the immunity that's generated, is it is possible, it seems, that people can become reinfected after 3, 4, 6 months, even though they've already been exposed to the virus and have recovered from it. And that's a scenario that is a different kind of challenge, and it's more analogous to the way we think of our flu now, like influenza, where you kind of have to get an influenza vaccine every year, and you've got all these strains. But we still have quite a number of people who develop flu every year and unfortunately pass away from it. So it seems to be following more of that paradigm, which makes Sweden's strategy not as smart. In conflict to that, we look at a place like South Korea. And what South Korea did was they tested the heck out of their population, where they found exactly where the virus was, who had it, and they tried to really clamp down and isolate those pockets. And what we've seen is that that strategy has actually been much more successful on a population level. And the numbers of cases and the number of deaths in a place like South Korea have actually been quite remarkably low for the size of their population. Another part of that equation is that South Korea had a lot of difficulty with the MERS and the SARS outbreaks from a couple of years ago. So they invested very, very heavily in their public health infrastructure to prepare for exactly this kind of circumstance. And I do think that they were very well prepared for that kind of a strategy, which is very resource intensive. And I think their population, their country is seeing the benefit of that. But again, I really think of those as sort of two examples on two ends of the spectrum. But hopefully that addressed your question.
Yeah, thank you very much. And when you were getting set up, I was remarking how brilliant you are, and your eyesight is incredible.
I'll have to thank my eye doctor for that new prescription of the contacts, but yes, I definitely appreciate that.
I have a question I'd like to ask.
Yeah, would you introduce yourself first?
My name is Jim Barrett. I'm a registered nurse. I work in occupational medicine, so I'm not in this field, but I'm hearing that there's some lead vaccine pharmacies or studies sort of out ahead, and there's one that's had some of the preliminary trials, 30,000 people, I think, or something like that. And so how many pharmaceutical companies are involved in this, and who's out front, and is the next step in that beyond the 30,000, when will they be able to actually ship the vaccine out?
Excellent questions. And so if I could, I'm going to share my screen again. Let me see, is there a slide coming up?
It says in slideshow, it said.
There was there and it disappeared.
Did it just disappear?
Yeah.
Okay. Let's try that one more time. Okay, is that working?
Yes.
Current
okay.
stages vaccine.
Okay. Yep. So these are, so when we talk about vaccine development, we do talk about these different stages of vaccines. Vaccines are a little bit different than drug development. And again, that's for me and my nerdy friends to talk about. We'll try not to borrow the whole crowd with that. But in terms of what you just described, in terms of these current late stage vaccines, this is the set that are kind of looked at in what we call phase 3 studies. Phase 3 is kind of the large studies that are done to prove the safety and efficacy of the vaccine before they receive regulatory approval to actually use in the general population. So the study that you talked about was related to this vaccine that's being developed by the company Moderna. And there's also kind of a parallel vaccine program that's being driven by Pfizer and BioNTech. And these vaccines have kind of crossed their initial studies, and now they're basically enrolling a huge number of patients, 30,000 patients. And again, these are not patients who have COVID. These are patients that they're going to study the immune response of the vaccine. And you're right, it's about 30,000 patients that they're trying to enroll very, very quickly. And that large number is usually necessary because they're trying to detect what are often very rare side effects. Vaccines in general, and especially with the new technologies that are used to develop these particular vaccines, are actually quite safe in general. But the kind of problems that may be developed, they can be very severe, but also very rare. And so one of the challenges is you have to study a lot of people to make sure that you're not having those rare events. And that's why these trials are so huge. But they are now entering that phase 3. And because of the acuity of the circumstance, they're, as you can imagine, they're getting lots of volunteers, lots of people are willing to try this. And the hope is probably the earliest time that we might see some initial results from these trials would be about either between October, November, more likely December of this year, that we would begin to see those results. And because it's a pandemic situation, the level of scrutiny, let's say, that the FDA is going to give this data may be a slightly lower standard. And I don't mean that in the sense that it's not that the vaccine doesn't work, but the level at which it works may be acceptable even if it's not necessarily what we would have done at a different time, if it wasn't such an acute public health emergency. And often what happens in these emergency circumstances is we'll get something out there. We know that it may not be perfect, but it's about 60 or 70% effective. And the benchmark that they're looking at right now is about 50% effectiveness. That may not sound like a lot, but if you think back to that graphic, even if we could get half of those people to be green, that still is a significant amount of reduction in the population potentially. And so that level of effectiveness, and then they would then monitor that vaccine and continue to modify it in what we call post-marketing surveillance. And I would say optimistically, the earliest we're talking about is between October, November, December of this year to actually get the vaccine approved, potentially, and then to get it out there, that's always a challenge. And one of the, if I can share this other slide, one of the things that really has happened is on the bottom of this slide, you see, this is kind of a new paradigm that's being applied right now in this outbreak where while the vaccine is actually within clinical development, and this is kind of where we're talking about phase 2, 3, at that same time, at risk, the companies are actually beginning to manufacture and scale up the manufacturing. Usually, this would happen at a later time after they have more confidence that the vaccine actually works. And you may have seen in the news recently that the government has actually agreed to a price point for some of these vaccines. And they've actually agreed to purchase a certain number of vaccines. Part of that is to incentivize these companies to begin the manufacturing and scaling up the manufacturing so that as soon as they hit this point, that this process of getting these out in large-scale manufacturing and getting it out to people, that time can be diminished. So that's kind of, it's a calculated risk that the government is doing, I think, in the interest of the population, to really give the company some confidence that if they can cross the finish line, that they can show that it's safe and effective, that there is a marketplace for it, and that investment they're making in the manufacturer right now won't be a huge loss for them, which it potentially could be. But again, this is kind of where we are right now, is in this step of the efficacy trials kind of proving that it's safe and effective, and you're seeing these companies really ramp up their manufacturing of these vaccines.
Thank you.
Some questions at this point here.
Jonas, can I ask a question?
Yes, Milia.
Okay, so I have a few, but I'll only ask one. But in terms of like how you were saying that sorry, that the development is going on without necessarily going all the way to the or where it normally would be because of the fact that it's a pandemic. I mean, within the pharmaceutical world, is that safe to do though? I mean, what if it turns out to be a really bad vaccine or side effects and causes I mean, is that realistic? I mean, obviously I'm coming from a perspective that knows absolutely nothing about the pharmaceutical world except what you have shared with us today. But I guess part of me makes me a little nervous thinking that, oh, hey, you know, we're not sure for sure. We haven't gotten through the whole process, but here's 1 million of these vaccines that we're going to go ahead and have people take.
Yeah, it's a very fair question. It's an excellent question. The element of the safety of the vaccine, I don't want people to leave with the idea that that safety of the vaccine is not going to be proven to a standard that is acceptable. So that safety standard will be established and it will be monitored exceedingly closely, even after the vaccine gets out on the market. So that is not what's being kind of fast-tracked here. What's being fast-tracked is the efficacy measures. So under a normal circumstance, you may wait for like 6-month results or 12-month results that the immunity is still persisting with the vaccine. And that is something that these companies will continue to be doing. They'll continue to monitor that. But what might happen is the FDA may say, you know, we've got 3 months with very positive indications that the efficacy of this, it is producing adequate immunity in the majority of these patients now. After a shorter amount of time, and therefore we're going to give it what we call a conditional approval. And we're going to allow it to roll out. But in the meantime, those same folks that we've studied now for 3 months, we're going to continue to follow them. And for the next 3 months, we're going to get more data and we're going to get more data. And we're going to simply make those decisions as that data comes in, as opposed to waiting for that full year that you might have normally done. And in that year, again, we're just going to lose more people, to be very blunt. This same model, this is not the first time that this sort of model has been applied. In the very early days of the HIV epidemic in the 1980s, this same mechanism, this same thought process was done in developing the very early HIV drugs. And so as we were learning about these retroviruses and we were learning about how to treat them, some of the very early drugs got fast-tracked in a similar way. And in general, those drugs held up actually quite well. And amazingly, 30 years later, gives me a sense of why I've got so much gray in my beard, but 30 years later, you are seeing that many of these drugs are still kind of the mainstay of HIV treatment, and they've had a tremendously positive impact. So I do think there is an upside to this, and I do think it's a reasonable middle course, both from the level of scientific evidence as well as the needs of public health. And I think the FDA, frankly, does a wonderful job of trying to find that right balance. Again, speaking as someone who's in the private sector who deals with the FDA all the time, I've always seen them, I'm actually very, very impressed with the level of their sort of balanced approach to understanding these issues. And COVID, I think, is a great example of where they did the same example with hydrochloroquine, where they had some initial evidence to suggest that it may have some benefit. They gave it a limited approval. They followed that very closely. When new data came out, they took it off the market. And so they do monitor this stuff very closely, and I think, and in general, they're very effective at doing that. And I did not receive any payment for giving them that endorsement, just for the record.
Did you have something else you wanted to say, Milia, or can I?
No, if others do, then please, I yield to them.
Is there a question from anyone else?
Well, I had one, if I could.
Okay, if you would introduce yourself first, if you would.
Hi, I'm Leslie Reese, member at Grace First. So I had a question with respect to the role of our government. If what the plans are, if any, for making the vaccines available for free in low-income communities.
Yes.
I guess one of the struggles in our country is the tension between you mentioned before, between the for-profit and the social services sectors. Do you have information about that?
It's an excellent question, Ms. Leslie. I very much appreciate that question. A big part of my interest when I was in academia was about this issue of racial and ethnic disparities in care, and kind of what are the drivers of that. And a vaccine is a perfect example where this pandemic has certainly hit certain communities much harder than others. And a big part of that has been both racial and ethnic factors, minorities, as well as economic factors. And what I have understood, and again, my knowledge of this is not necessarily firsthand, it's also just from my reading of what comes out in the news reports. But when I read a little bit of detail about the contract and the way that it was structured when the government made a contract recently with Pfizer, as well as, if I believe correctly, it was Moderna, the other company, their purchase price, part of the reason that they agreed to purchase a certain number of vaccines, I think it was close to 50 million vaccines, was with the idea that they could price it at a point that they would then be able to provide it free of charge. And so that price point was about $30. It comes up to like $30 or $35 per vaccine. So by buying it en masse, the government is kind of leveraging its buying power to be able to provide that vaccine. And there are other examples, and we have numerous examples now, where many vaccines are administered through departments of public health throughout the country on a free basis. So a lot of the vaccines that we require for children when they go to school, because they're required by the state, they're required by the locale, there's also an infrastructure behind that through departments of public health that people are able to go to these public vaccination clinics. And I think some of that infrastructure will probably be utilized to disseminate this vaccine as well. Now, the mass numbers of people that will have to vaccinate, I think once this vaccine comes out, is going to present certainly a level of challenge, and that challenge may be felt more in some of the communities that you've described and that we have concern about. But at least on the surface of it, the intent is that the vaccine would be provided free of charge to a large majority. And at least reading through the numbers, I think that the pharmaceutical companies have signed those contracts, and that price point is fixed for while the pandemic is in place. So as long as we're seeing the numbers that we're seeing right now, that price is not going to change. And I do think for once the government actually negotiated very smartly, is my impression.
Good question, Leslie. Thank you. Are there others?
Yeah, I have another question. This is Jim Barrett. With the World Health Organization being defunded by the United States, is the international coordination with the American scientists and doctors working out?
It's a wonderful question. I don't personally have a view to that or really know how well that's working. I do get a sense from the medical literature that it is interesting that in this circumstance where there is so much to learn from other countries, that we're beginning to see that maturity make its way into the medical literature. So what we are seeing is the publishing of papers by groups across countries, certainly at the immunological level, trying to understand the virus. But because of that lack of kind of international cooperation, it has been approached a little bit differently than more recent pandemics. If we compare this to kind of how SARS was managed, or MERS, which are also kind of fairly recent coronavirus outbreaks, those were managed, and they were a little bit more localized geographically, but it struck me that the coordinated response and the similar strategies that were applied in countries, there's been much less uniformity across countries in how they've approached this. And because of that, I think what we're realizing very quickly is that our borders are just that, but they're very porous. And ultimately, the strategies that have to be taken do need to be applied kind of consistently across countries. So on a scientific basis, I still see plenty of international exchange, but on the policy level, I do think countries are much less likely to follow WHO's recommendations than they might have in the past. And the United States is a prime example of that, where I think the authority has really been ceded to local authorities almost to kind of make up their own rules as they're going along. And sometimes that works well. And I think we have some examples where that has worked well, other examples where I think maybe we have had maybe more suffering than was necessary, frankly, if we had been a little bit more consistent in our approach. But it's a very challenging circumstance on so many levels. But WHO's role definitely, I think, has been a little bit diminished here. And as we know, not having those funds behind them, I think also will diminish their effectiveness.
Thank you.
I'd like to ask a question.
Yes, if you would introduce yourself and then.
Yeah, this is Sue, and I'll see if I can figure out how to turn on my video. Can you see me?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so you had the shout out to the FDA, and that now you've answered the question about the WHO, and so now I wondered, what is your perspective on the CDC?
And it's always interesting to me that these are acronyms that always have 3 letters. One of these days, we're going to have to name an agency with more than 3 letters. But yeah, CDC. Again, someone who has like myself has a public health background, I think I always have a bias in terms of CDC is a tremendous organization. It is the world-class organization for understanding infectious disease. And I do appreciate that its effectiveness, or people's perception of its effectiveness when it comes to COVID, has been somewhat limited. I think if we were to think about something like smallpox, that no longer is something we have to talk about, a big part of the credit for getting rid of smallpox in the world is deserved by CDC scientists and CDC epidemiologists and the strategies that they developed. So that being said, I have tremendous respect for them. I think right now, I think CDC has been embroiled in a bit, unfortunately, of the political context of, and I think the political context has limited their ability to be effective. Now, CDC in general is a federal agency that in general produces guidelines. They don't necessarily produce statutes. So as an example, FDA can produce a regulatory approval or non-approval of a drug or a virus. And that's something that affects whether something becomes available or not. CDC's role is more along providing guidelines that then usually are kind of universally adopted by localities. So they would produce a guideline that would guide like the opening of schools. That's a very difficult subject that we're all grappling with in our communities right now. The opening of universities, the opening of small businesses, larger businesses, and so on. So they would provide some guidelines related to that. I think what's happened now is CDC has really lost some credibility, even with local public health departments, and there's a whole series of reasons for that. One reason is I think there was a bit of bungling about the rollout of the original testing. The original tests that CDC had kind of touted, they didn't work right. And inevitably in a pandemic and in this sort of a circumstance, there's going to be those circumstances, but that I think hurt their credibility up front. So people were like, we've got these tests, but we can't use them, or they're not giving us the right result. That hurt their credibility. And then the clarity with which they did not kind of provide consistent guidance, I think that also has caused their credibility to be diminished. And when I talk to like my colleagues that are sort of working in local public health departments, or my colleagues that are out there practicing, they never mention CDC, frankly. They don't mention CDC's name a whole lot. I sometimes raise it with them, and then what does CDC say about this? I'm like, well, they said this or this or this, and it doesn't really matter to what they're doing day to day. So I do think their effectiveness, now I don't think that their effectiveness is always going to be limited. I think as this pandemic stretches out, I hope that they can reestablish some of that credibility, because they have some tremendously talented and thoughtful people there. And they really have trained some of the best public health officials in the country. And at least personally, I see it as a shame that I think the public's perception of them has dropped so quickly. I think human nature is sort of, what have you done for me lately? And people are feeling that CDC hasn't done a lot for us lately. But again, it's a long-winded answer. They also did not pay me to say that, but it's just, that's my sense of it. My sense is I do think we haven't heard the last of them, and I do think they're going to play a very important role as we move forward through this pandemic.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. We're really in our last 5 minutes. I think Milia, I wonder if you could kind of do wrap up and announcements and.
Sure. Jonas, may I just ask one last question real quick?
Yeah.
Okay, so Dr. Arozullah, some of you know, so one of the things that you talked about is the fact of the vaccine might be coming out at the end of November, December, and then that has to be then obviously administered to individuals and things like that. So that process in itself, how long does that take? And one of the questions when I was talking to my peers about this program that we're having, one of the questions that came up repeatedly, which I very well understand on a personal level, is, practically what does that mean? So say if the vaccine is out in December, you're saying, October, November is something that's, possibly. So let's say December. So does that mean in January I can go to Kaiser Permanente and get my vaccine, and on February I can get on that plane and go see my family, in Missouri? Or Dr. Arozullah is actually my family. He's married to my cousin, or go to Chicago and see all of you?
Yeah.
Or what does that mean in terms of actual, act of going and seeing people that you haven't seen in such a long time?
Yes, full disclosure, Milia is present in all of my wedding photos. She was a little kid at the time. And unfortunately, I still see her as that. I mean, when you call her executive director, I have a hard time wrapping my head around that. But it has certainly grown into a remarkable person. So she is asking the question because she misses her mom and dad, and I get that. And I think that's how many of us feel. We miss our families, we miss our relatives. It's a very real question. When I describe the idea that the vaccine may be, what I'm trying to say is that the vaccine may be approved by the FDA come November, December. Because the manufacturing has been ramped up ahead of time, there is the possibility that the time frame between the approval and getting it out into the clinics and getting it out into hospitals so that it can actually be administered, that time should be relatively short. And it is conceivable within a month or two of that approval, we may see a significant number of these vaccines actually get shipped. Now, the technology that's used to develop the vaccine may not necessarily be as well developed to mass produce the vaccine. So that's something that's being worked out now. And assuming that that biotechnology sector continues to be able to do that well and be able to ramp up and sort of scale up that production, it very well may be a circumstance, optimistically, that by towards the end of the winter time, winter is very long in Chicago. That's January, February, March for those of you in Southern California. So January through March or so that we would see the vaccines get out there. And then I think the other hope is that if the numbers tend to be low, that's when some of the travel restrictions or when people might feel a little bit more comfortable traveling. So you've gotten the vaccine, you've had a couple of weeks to let the vaccine work in your system, and the overall numbers around you are relatively low, are a little bit colder, and then that may be a circumstance where people will feel safer to travel. But it's a really tough question. And I do appreciate, Amelia, if your first visit is to Missouri, but you better come to Chicago after that, okay? Because we miss you terribly.
Thank you, Dr. Arozullah. Is there, Jonas, what would you like me to do?
Yes, if you would maybe just share like what's coming up next week, you could share about the opportunities to give and support.
Absolutely. First and foremost, thank you so much, Dr. Arozullah, for taking the time and being with us and answering our questions. This is videotaped and we do put it on our YouTube channel. However, let us know if that's something that's problematic, and of course, we'll respect your wishes. In terms of what's coming up, Cheryl, may I ask, are you able to share some of those? Perfect. Okay. So some of the programs that we have coming up, we just wanted to kind of share a little bit about that is, for those of you who are familiar with our work, you know that the summer months we have the Interfaith Cafes. Obviously this year we're not able to meet physically. However, we've kind of molded into a way where we can still have it over Zoom. So to that effect, on this Sunday is our first one. And we hope that you can join us. And Cheryl is just zooming through those. No worries. This Sunday is from 3 to 4:30, so please let us know if you can join. Just send us an email at office@sdinterfaith.org to get the link. The next one, Cheryl, that would be great. Thank you. Okay. Whichever one is next for you, I'll roll with that. You're muted, my friend.
I think this is the next one to occur.
Okay. Okay.
It's showing August Interfaith Cafe. I think maybe it might be that you have to pull up a separate document if it's going to show. So what you're looking at might not be what we're looking at.
Oh, well, what are you looking at?
August Interfaith Cafe.
Oh, sorry.
That's okay. That's okay. Thank you, Cheryl.
Share. And
all right. So we'll, another thing that we're starting up again is our Religion 101 obviously we stopped it for some time, since March, in fact, because of the pandemic. However, we are going to continue that again via Zoom, and that we have planned until next April. So this Thursday, or this August 27th, that Thursday will be our first on Zoom, and it will actually be Dr. Shah, who is a member of the Jain community of Southern California. And we'll have more information about this, but if you're interested in attending, please let us know and just send Cheryl an email and she'll share the information about the Zoom. And the Religion 101, as you know, is the fourth Thursday of every month at 7 p.m. And like I said, in the next couple of months, it'll be done on, over Zoom. Next, Cheryl.
all right. Next one here.
One of the things that, obviously as an interfaith council, we really pride ourselves in regards to making sure that we're there for the collective community and the challenges that they might be facing. One of the things that you might have noticed in articles and in just in the media is that there has been a rise, unfortunately, in Asian American and Pacific Islanders, really a discrimination towards them, facing racism, particularly in regards to the pandemic. And that has been considerably rising as the times go on. So we wanted to have a program that addresses just that and provide a sense of support for those who are facing this type of racism. So to that end, we have a fantastic panel. We're just waiting for one more confirmation of a professor from UCLA, but we have 4 panelists who will be speaking on August 30th about this topic and about what we as an interfaith community can do to provide support to those who might be facing discrimination and racism, particularly pertaining to the pandemic within the Asian American and Pacific Islander neighbors. So that's on August 30th, and we hope that we'll join you for that. Join us for that. And I think we have just one more,
Yep.
and then we'll conclude for today. And that is our gala. So every year we have a gala. Usually this gala is beautiful. It's literally right by the sea, overseeing the ocean in one of our board members' houses, which is just beautiful. But obviously this year we can't do it, but at the same time we still wanted to continue the tradition. So to that end, please save this date, on October 11th, Sunday, we hope to continue this tradition and have the second annual gala. But of course we'll have it on Zoom, but it'll just be an afternoon of just music, fellowship, and really a inspiration for all of us to kind of go as we're going through this pandemic collectively as an interfaith community. And I think the last slide is, as you know, we're trying our best to develop programs and continue the work that we do, but obviously the pandemic has affected us, as all of us, in some negative ways, and specifically financially. Obviously our programs, our three main fundraisers have been canceled because we cannot meet in person. So if you're able to, we would be so appreciative and grateful for any support that you're able to provide. You can go on our website and there's a donate button and press there, and any support would allow us to continue these programs that we have and that we plan to have in the coming months. And that is all I have to say. I do hope that you'll join us for next week or next month as well. We're just waiting final confirmation, but it looks like our speaker will be Pastor Q. Some of you guys are familiar with Pastor Q. He has what he calls a church without walls, and he caters to our friends on Skid Row. And so every Sunday he has a service. He does tremendous humanitarian work. And he will actually be speaking about the plight of the homeless, as well as those who are on Skid Row and how this pandemic is affecting them and what we can do to be of service towards them. So that will be the first Thursday in October. And as things get more finalized, we'll share that flyer with you as well.
Thank you very much, Milia. And well, let's give a hand if you do maybe clap or offer one of these for Dr. Hassan Arozullah. We are so thankful that you've been with us and have shared just great information, but the way you shared it, it was just really, I think I heard somebody say in one of the chat boxes, thank you for the straight talk. You really made it very clear and understandable, something very complex. So we appreciate that. And thank you all so much. Do you have any parting word for us, Dr. Arozullah, or any kind of thing you'd like to share?
Sure. No, just again, I think all of us are praying very hard that everyone stays safe, and really that that this pandemic takes as few people as necessary, and that as soon as is possible that God removes this from us, because it is a horrible circumstance. And again, just my personal apologies for the difficulty with the sound at the beginning. I probably wasn't saying anything that important anyway, so you didn't miss much. But again, thank you so much for the opportunity to share some time with everybody. I really appreciate it. And excellent questions and very thoughtful group. Amelia, I'll expect my check in the mail, so it's all good.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Thank you so much. Peace and grace with all of you, and we hope to see you next Friday at 3 o'clock for the next Courageous Conversation. Have a great weekend.
Thank you, Jonas.